For 7 seasons, he was the guy under the hood. The one who kept a rowdy fictional county's engines running, its secret safe, and its jokes landing. Millions of viewers knew him as Cooter Davenport, the mechanic who made Hazzard County feel like a place worth visiting every Friday night. Far fewer knew the man behind him, a former civil rights sit-in participant, a 2-term member of Congress, a recovering alcoholic who rebuilt his life from scratch, and finally, a small business owner who spent his last 3 decades running museums built entirely on the goodwill of strangers who never stopped loving a TV mechanic. Ben Jones died on August 9, 2026, at his home in Washington, Virginia, of a sudden heart attack. He was 84 years old. His wife, Alma Viator, said he had settled into his favorite chair that Sunday afternoon, waiting for the Atlanta Braves to take on the New York Yankees. He never saw the first pitch. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from former castmates, fans, and political colleagues. And so did a quieter, more complicated story, one about what a man who lived an extraordinarily full life actually left behind, financially speaking, and why that number said less about failure than it did about how he chose to spend 8 decades on Earth. Ben Lewis Jones was born on August 30, 1941, in Tarboro, North Carolina, and raised mostly in Portsmouth, Virginia. His father worked the rails for the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, and the family lived for a time in housing near the docks that had no electricity or indoor plumbing. It was the kind of scarcity that shapes a person permanently, and in Jones's case, it seems to have fed both a hunger to escape and a lasting identification with working people that would define his politics decades later. He graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School in 1959 and went on to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he found something that reoriented the rest of his life: the stage. Performing with the university's Carolina Playmakers, and later doing summer stock and the long-running outdoor drama Unto These Hills in Cherokee, North Carolina, Jones discovered that he could hold an audience. That discovery took him to Atlanta in the late 1960s, where he spent years working with the Alliance Theater, the Atlanta Children's Theater, and Theater of the Stars, appearing in well over 100 productions before he ever stepped in front of a television camera. That theater grounding mattered. When Jones eventually landed the role that would define him publicly, he brought the instincts of a stage actor who had already spent a decade learning how to make a character breathe. It's worth pausing on just how unlikely that trajectory was. Southern Regional Theater in the 1960s and early 1970s wasn't a path anyone chose for money or fame. It was a path chosen because a person genuinely couldn't picture doing anything else. Jones spent years working for scale or close to it, learning the discipline of live performance in front of audiences who had no patience for a flat delivery or a missed cue. By the time television came calling, he wasn't a newcomer figuring out how a camera worked. He was a trained performer who happened to be walking into his first big screen role with more stage experience than most of the actors he'd soon be sharing scenes with. Jones's first meaningful screen credit came in 1975 in a low-budget bootlegger film called Moonrunners, directed by G.Y. Waldron and narrated by country star Waylon Jennings. It didn't make him famous, but it made him known to the right person. When Waldron reworked the same world of moonshiners, fast cars, and small-town southern sheriffs into a television pilot for CBS a few years later, Jones was one of the actors brought back for the new version. That pilot became The Dukes of Hazzard, which premiered on CBS in January 1979. Jones was cast as Cooter Davenport, the town's lone mechanic and tow truck operator, a character built, almost by design, to be indispensable. In a show where the main characters wrecked cars for a living, somebody had to fix them, and Cooter was that somebody. He appeared in all 141 episodes across the show's 7 seasons, which ran until February 1985. The Dukes of Hazzard wasn't a modest hit. During the 1979 to 1980 season, it ranked second in the Nielsen ratings, trailing only Dallas, which followed it on the CBS Friday night lineup. For a show about good old boys outrunning a corrupt county commissioner, that kind of reach was extraordinary, and Cooter, with his CB radio chatter and easy grin, became one of its most affectionately remembered characters, often described by fans as an honorary member of the Duke family himself. Behind the scenes, Jones was not shy about having opinions. During the second season, he briefly left the production over a dispute about whether Cooter should be clean-shaven, and other actors filled in for the character until the disagreement was resolved. It was a small episode, but a telling one. The man audiences saw as endlessly agreeable had a stubborn streak that would resurface, more consequentially, later in life. Part of what made Cooter resonate with audiences was that he wasn't positioned as a hero. He wasn't the one outrunning the sheriff in the General Lee, and he wasn't the romantic interest. He was the guy who showed up when something broke, fixed it without much fuss, and got back to his own business. That kind of role is easy to overlook on paper and surprisingly hard to pull off on screen. It requires an actor who can make competence and reliability feel charming rather than flat. Jones managed it well enough that Cooter frequently ranked among fans' favorite characters on the show, despite getting a fraction of the screen time given to the Duke cousins themselves. He was also, by his own account, in the middle of significant personal turmoil during much of this period, 3 marriages by the time he turned 40, and years of heavy drinking. Jones later said he achieved sobriety at 36, a turning point he described in his memoir with a line that stuck with readers. He wrote that he got sober the day before he died, a way of framing recovery as something that had to be renewed daily, not something achieved once and forgotten. When The Dukes of Hazzard ended in 1985, most actors in Jones's position faced the familiar trap of a beloved character. Audiences don't want to see you as anyone else. Jones sidestepped the problem almost entirely. Instead of chasing new auditions, he ran for Congress. His first attempt, in 1986, was against Georgia Republican incumbent Pat Swindle for the state's 4th congressional district. Jones lost, but not by much. He pulled 47% of the vote, a strong enough showing that political observers took him seriously as more than a novelty candidate. He ran again in 1988 and won decisively, defeating Swindle with roughly 60% of the vote after Swindle had been indicted on perjury charges. On January 3, 1989, Jones was sworn into the 101st Congress as a Democratic representative from Georgia's 4th District. He served on the Committee on Public Works and Transportation and the Committee on Merchant Marine and Fisheries, assignments that tracked closely with the practical concerns of his constituents. He won re-election narrowly in 1990. Colleagues who served alongside him during those years generally described a lawmaker whose priorities tracked with the district he came from rather than with national party ambitions, infrastructure, waterways, and the kind of unglamorous constituent services that rarely make headlines but matter enormously to the people affected by them. It was, in its way, a continuation of the same instinct that had made Cooter believable on screen, a preference for showing up and doing the practical work rather than chasing the spotlight. His run in Congress ended not through scandal, but through redistricting. After the 1990 census, Georgia's district lines were redrawn in a way that moved Jones's own home out of the district he represented. Running in the redrawn territory's 1992 Democratic primary, he lost. Rather than fade quietly out of politics, he ran once more in 1994, this time against Newt Gingrich, then the House Minority Whip and soon to become Speaker of the House. It was not a competitive race, and Jones knew it going in. He ran it anyway, which by most accounts of people who knew him was very much in character. Ben Jones did not appear to calculate his fights purely by their odds of success. His congressional papers, spanning 78 cubic feet of material, are now archived at the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia, a record of a 4-year run in Washington sandwiched between 2 very different American lives, one on a soundstage and one built later, back among the fans who never let Cooter go. After Washington, Jones returned to the world that had made him famous in the first place, but this time as an entrepreneur rather than an employee. In 1999, he and his wife Alma Viator opened Cooter's Place in Sperryville, Virginia, part museum, part memorabilia shop, built entirely around the Dukes of Hazzard and Jones's own place in its history. It worked. The business eventually expanded to additional locations in Pigeon Forge and Nashville, Tennessee, and Luray, Virginia, drawing fans who had grown up on the show decades earlier and wanted a tangible connection to it. The scale of that fan devotion became clear at Dukes Fest, an annual gathering Jones helped organize. A 2006 event in Nashville reportedly drew more than 100,000 fans, described by local media at the time as the largest turnout the city had ever recorded for a fan convention of any kind. It was not a studio-backed production. It was two people who understood their audience building something durable out of nostalgia year after year. Jones never really stopped performing, either. He fronted Cooter's garage band for decades, playing festivals, fairs, and fan events across the country, and the group released more than a dozen albums, including one in 2020 titled, Play Me an Old Song. Music had run through his life since his theater days, and the band gave him a reason to keep showing up in front of an audience well into his 80s. In 2007, Random House published his memoir, Redneck Boy in the Promised Land, The Confessions of Crazy Cooter. It was more candid than most books written by television actors tend to be. Jones wrote openly about his poverty-stricken childhood, his struggles with alcohol, his failed early marriages, and, perhaps most surprisingly to readers who knew him only as a good-natured Southern mechanic, his participation in civil rights sit-ins during the 1960s. That detail complicated the public's tidy image of him and added real depth to a life that had already taken more turns than most. Running Cooter's place was not, by most descriptions, a passive licensing arrangement where Jones simply lent his name to a storefront. He and Viator were hands-on operators, present at their locations, meeting fans directly, and building the annual gatherings that kept the business relevant decades after the show itself had stopped producing new episodes. That kind of ongoing personal presence is part of what separates a lasting fan business from a short-lived novelty shop, and it's a large part of why Cooter's Place was still operating, and still meaningful to fans, at the time of Jones's death nearly 3 decades after the show went off the air. When word of Jones's death spread, so did questions about what, exactly, he left behind financially. The figure most commonly cited by celebrity wealth tracking sites, including Celebrity Net Worth, put his estate at roughly $500,000. A handful of other outlets, accounting for the value of the Cooter's Place brand and related business assets, put the number somewhat higher, with some estimates reaching toward $1 million to $2 million once real estate and merchandise operations were factored in. None of these figures came from an official itemized public accounting. They were estimates built from a life led largely outside Hollywood's traditional pay structures. However the number is calculated, it lands well below what people often assume about a man who spent 141 episodes on one of the most watched shows of its era, then served in Congress, then built a museum empire, recorded a dozen albums, and wrote a best-selling memoir. Television character actors, even beloved ones, typically earn a fraction of what marquee stars make. Congressional salaries in the late 1980s and early 1990s were solid but unremarkable by today's standards. And a themed museum chain, however beloved, is a modest-margin business propped up largely by ticket sales, merchandise, and the goodwill of longtime fans, not the kind of enterprise that produces generational wealth. There's also the matter of what Jones himself described in his memoir, years of financial instability tied to 3 early marriages, a period of heavy drinking, and the unpredictable income that comes with being a working actor rather than a headliner. By the time he achieved sobriety and started making more deliberate decisions about his career and his money, he was rebuilding, not simply accumulating. Cooter's Place, which came together in his late 50s, represented his most successful sustained business effort, but it arrived relatively late in a life that had already moved through several distinct chapters. None of this means Jones died in hardship. He and Viator owned a log cabin and farm property in Rappahannock County, Virginia, purchased in 1998, and the couple lived comfortably by most accounts. But the gap between the size of his public footprint, a role still airing in syndication worldwide, museums bearing his character's name in 3 states, a shelf of albums and a published memoir, and the modest dollar figure attached to his estate is what struck so many people, including, reportedly, members of his own family. It is one thing to know intellectually that fame and fortune don't always move together. It's another to see the final numbers laid out after someone is gone and realize just how much of a person's energy went toward things that simply don't show up on a balance sheet. Fan relationships built over decades, a congressional term devoted to constituents rather than fundraising, an honest memoir instead of a sanitized one, a recovery maintained one day at a time for nearly 50 years. Jones was survived by Viator, his wife of more than 3 decades, along with his children, a daughter, Rachel, from an earlier marriage, a second daughter, Jean, and a son, Walker, born in 1983. He was also stepfather to 3 additional children through his marriage to Viator. Tributes from his former castmates emphasized the personal loss as much as the professional one. Tom Wopat, who played Luke Duke opposite him for all 7 seasons, called him a fine friend and a fierce advocate, and said the cast had lost one of its own. Viator's own words, shared publicly in the hours after his death, captured something that no estate valuation ever could, a description of a rich, full life, deeply loved and deeply loving in return. It's tempting, in stories like this one, to treat a modest net worth figure as some kind of twist, proof that fame is hollow, or that Hollywood chews people up. That's not really what Ben Jones's story shows. His life reads less like a cautionary tale and more like a rebuttal to the idea that a successful life has to leave behind an impressive number. He spent 4 years in Congress representing people whose economic reality he understood firsthand because he'd lived it as a child. He spent decades building a business from nothing, twice, once in show business starting from a railroad shack with no electricity, and once in Sperryville, Virginia, starting from a fan's affection for a mechanic character and turning it into museums that still stand in 3 states. He wrote a memoir that told the truth about alcoholism and failed marriages instead of the comfortable version most celebrities settle for. And he stayed sober, one day at a time, for the better part of 50 years, after nearly losing everything to drinking in his 30s. The Dukes of Hazzard still runs in syndication around the world. Cooter's Place still draws visitors. Dukes Fest is remembered as one of the largest fan gatherings a city like Nashville has ever hosted. None of that appears on an estate statement, and none of it was ever going to. Ben Jones seemed to understand, long before his death, that the fortune worth building wasn't the kind you could count. It was the kind that showed up in the number of people who felt, for 1 hour a week across 7 seasons and for decades of museum visits afterward, that a good-natured mechanic from a fictional Georgia county was looking out for them. That, more than any number attached to his estate, is what made the people who loved him cry.